So next, we'll go into chapter 3, which covers resources and funding. So this chapter examines program funding needs, identifies strategies and tools for calculating required funding and determining the necessary staffing levels. So the most exciting chapter for me. Then we have a diagram on the right-hand side. This is kind of what guided our chapter. We have identifying program and funding needs. The program needs are the required components of a maintenance and inspection program, like administration and enforcement requirements. The resource needs are the staff and equipment needs for the program. So funding ongoing maintenance and inspection programs is something that can be challenging. Stormwater utility benefits aren't something that's always understood by the community, why they're important. And it's important to properly budget and allocate resources for these programs. As part of that, you have to identify and understand the needs of the program. So we can determine funding estimates after first establishing those program needs. That's what I'm going to talk about next. To determine those program needs, we want to gather information needed to define the level of effort for all aspects of the program. We can do that by reviewing existing records or collecting data in the field. We want to draw from records or estimates of time needed to implement each program task. And then once you have those records or estimates, those can be multiplied by frequency. So you can get an estimated time to perform the tasks to generate estimates of funding and staffing needs. One thing that we've found is recommended is to use consistent units when you're doing these calculations, or pick a specific basis, like on a yearly basis or a permit cycle, just to make those calculations easier. So the next step is to determine staffing needs. Identifying staffing and equipment needs is something that's necessary to meet your program needs. The staff might be made up of a variety of experience levels, so it's important to include those different hourly rates and time needed to complete each task. And then equipment is something that could be estimated as a one-time purchase or as a rental cost. And the program, staff, and equipment needs are grouped in our estimator, which I'll talk on the next slide, in the categories on the graphic on the right-hand side. So we've grouped them into administration and financial management, operations and maintenance requirements, inspection requirements, regulation and enforcement requirements, public involvement and education requirements, and record keeping reporting requirements. These were developed with input from our TAC. So that calculator that I mentioned on the last slide, that's in Appendix 3. We've developed that program funding needs calculator that was developed to estimate program costs using the program, staffing, and equipment needs. Information that you'd need to gather to use that tool would include quantities, time, frequency, and you can use whatever method best suits your jurisdiction. We made this tool pretty simple. It was intended to just be a starting point. We know everybody has different priorities, so feel free to build on it, get rid of tabs. That was what it was meant for. When gathering the information for this tool, we wanted to point out too that you can use existing or collected data as mentioned previously, but also we do have some data from literature sources in the manual. They're pretty limited, but we did include those. The actual equations that we used in that calculating tool include what I'm going to go through on this slide. The first one is just the overall funding needs. So that's the staff costs plus the equipment costs plus any material costs, so like your E&O flyers. The next equation is estimating staff cost. So that would be looking at the number of times you perform a task, the time needed to perform the task, how frequently that occurs on your basis, what the staff rates are, and then overhead rates. Equation 3 is just to kind of check how many staff are actually needed from your staff cost. Equation number 4 is meant to estimate your equipment costs. So if you have, say, a number of equipment that you need per staff, that's the first part of the equation. The next part is if you have equipment that uses a cost sharing proportion. So if you share it between different departments, and then that overhead cost at the end is just, say you need like office equipment, or you have kind of a lump sum cost that you want to include. And then the last equation is for materials. This is similar to the other formulas where we have quantity, frequency, and cost per unit. So maybe you send out E&O flyers a certain number of times per permit cycle. There's another, that would be representative of the first half of the equation, where you have just kind of like a one-time cost. And then the second half of the equation would be when you have a cost sharing proportion. So we have a detailed calculation, or we have an example calculation here. If anybody wants to get a calculator, you're more than welcome. If anybody brought a calculator, good for you. Assume a stormwater department evaluates the cost of a seasonal inspector to inspect 300 BMPs. So that would be our quantity. It takes a seasonal inspector 2 hours on average to inspect a BMP on private property and to update the GIS database for the BMPs. So that's our amount of time that it would take. Since this calculation evaluates the cost of the seasonal inspector for 1 year, assume the frequency or number of times this task has to occur on a basis is 1, so that's our frequency. A seasonal inspector earns 30 per hour and has an overhead rate of 1.2. To keep this example brief, we are actually just going to focus on the cost to inspect the BMPs, and I'll kind of briefly glaze over the cost of the equipment and cost of materials. So using our equation 2 on one of the previous slides, we can calculate the staff cost. We use the quantity, time needed, frequency, staff rates, and overhead rate from the previous slide to get our product there. We can also check if the workload requires more than one seasonal inspector using equation 3 in one of the previous slides. We are assuming the seasonal inspector works full-time for 5 months each year, starting May 1st and ending September 30th. So entering in, we should have one seasonal inspector should suffice. So I mentioned previously that in addition to existing data, you use literature sources in the calculator or just when estimating. Literature sources are just another way to estimate different aspects of the program funding. The manual includes sources for O&M costs only. That was what we were able to locate in the literature. It just provides a good starting point. These numbers will require a critical review for the reasons that are included in the graphic on the right. Important considerations include the estimates might not address climate and other regional influences. You'll see that these estimates are from different locations across the country. The estimates also may not reflect recent cost changes or inflation since the study that we're going to reference was published. Published fees might also need adjusting for cost of living differences as well. And then different states and locations use different types of BMPs, so those costs might be off accordingly. So this table just has the list of BMP costs that we were able to identify. You kind of see that these studies are fairly old that we were able to locate. We have different BMP types. We have $ per year per either square foot, runoff volume, or impervious area managed by the BMP. These are really just going to provide starting points. Another tool we did identify as well was the Mile High Flood District in Colorado put together a BMP life cycle tool. So that would be another one where you would want to take into consideration the cost of living. It's a different region, something to keep in mind when you're looking through that tool.
Okay, so once you have identified all of your program needs and costs, you can begin to develop a funding strategy. So in the Yakima County Effectiveness Study, 1/3 of all respondents reported that they do not have enough funding for all of their stormwater programs. As Taylor said, this has been reported as challenging, especially when getting like backing from the community, because stormwater isn't something you see the benefits like you do for electricity or your water or your wastewater. So we're going to walk through a couple funding strategies. This is not necessarily just for BMPs on private property. This is stormwater programs as a whole, and just walk through some of the methods. So funding methods are generally split into two types of methods. You have your primary funding methods, which in general can cover most of your stormwater, the cost of most of your stormwater programs. You can then supplement these with secondary funding methods. And the thing about the secondary funding methods is there's usually some type of condition or something that you have to be eligible for. So unfortunately, not everyone can go out and get all of them. So for primary funding methods, this is generally, there have been two approaches. Historically, stormwater has been included in just a general fund for jurisdictions. So this just looks like the basic account for the financial resources for the jurisdiction. It's not always this way, but usually this has been funded by property taxes. So it's based on how the property assesses. There's really not a relationship to stormwater or the amount of stormwater that the property generates. It's also important to note that generally this is just for tax-paying properties. So you have your tax-exempt properties, which can be government buildings, universities. What's really important to remember about those is these are generally, especially universities, larger parcels, lots of impervious surface, generating lots of stormwater runoff, and are not those that are contributing to this fund. So for that reason, it has been seen as not equitable when it comes to funding stormwater management. And then what's also really important too is these funds are distributed between all the different departments, and stormwater is not always the priority. Also, as each new permit cycle comes out, there are more requirements, more programs, more program elements, more documentation. And at the end of the day, that costs money. So your general fund is not always going to scale with the need of your stormwater program funding. So what we have seen as being the more traditional route now is actually developing a stormwater utility fee. So this is a utility fee that is based on the services that are provided. So this is we're much more familiar with this. This is again like your water, your electricity, or your wastewater. So this revenue is dedicated solely to stormwater management. Like I said, it's becoming the popular method, and this applies to tax-paying and tax-exempt properties. There are a couple of different ways that these stormwater utility fees are generally calculated, which we'll walk through in a second, but it has been reported to be a sustainable funding source for these programs. So the three common methods used to calculate this are the equivalent residential unit, or the ERU, the intensity of development, or the equivalent hydraulic area. So the first one to walk through is the equivalent residential unit. This has been reported as the most popular method. So how this works is this is based on the impervious surface of a single family residential property, and that is equal to 1 ERU. That is generally determined by taking a large sample of the single family residential properties, impervious areas of those, and is usually averaged to figure out what that 1 ERU is going to look like. And it's billed at that 1 ERU rate that is set. So then all of the non-single family residential properties, the impervious surface for those are calculated, and that is divided by the impervious surface of the 1 ERU, and then you're billed at the equivalent ERUs that the property has. So to everything, there's some advantages and disadvantages to this strategy. In general, I want to say all of these strategies are difficult to explain to the public, but in general, this one is reported as easier than others, and that is generally because it is directly related to impervious surface. This is one of the things I think is easier for the public to connect. More impervious surface, more stormwater runoff, I'm paying more. However, on the disadvantage side, this can be seen as not the most equitable method, and that's because we are only taking the impervious surface into account. So for example, you and your neighbor, you have the same amount of pervious surface on your property, but your neighbor has a yard or land that's 5 times larger than yours. impervious surface doesn't generate a lot, but there is still a contribution, and you are paying the same rate as your neighbor, regardless of what the difference of your pervious surface is. This is easier for jurisdictions to calculate because you're only having to calculate the impervious surface for each parcel. So that is an advantage. But then the disadvantage is you're only billing the developed parcels. So this would then not apply to undeveloped parcels. The next common strategy is the intensity of development. And intensity of development is based on the percent impervious surface of the property. This is generally billed in intervals. So as you can see, as an example on the screen, you have a 0%. So you are billing those undeveloped properties. And then you have a different rate for each interval. So the advantages and disadvantages to this method, you are now taking into account more than just impervious surface. You're taking that entire lot size into account. So it is seen as a little bit more equitable. But the disadvantage of that is you're often billing in an interval. So again, you and your neighbor, you have 21% impervious surface, your neighbor has 49% impervious surface, you're paying the same rate. So that's something that, again, if you're choosing these methods, when you're thinking about these disadvantages, a lot of it is how can you prep yourself to communicate this and just defend the strategies that you're picking. Another advantage is now that both undeveloped and developed parcels are being billed. And then a few other disadvantages. Now you're needing to calculate not just the impervious surface, but the total parcel. And then now that we are introducing that pervious aspect to it, it can be a little bit more difficult to explain to the public. The final method is that we're going to discuss in this manual is the equivalent hydraulic area. So this is based on both the impervious and the pervious surface of each parcel. So you have a rate that is set for each type. In general, your impervious surface is billed at a rate that's much higher than your pervious surface. So then you're multiplying each of those areas by the respective rates, and you're adding to get the total monthly or annual stormwater fee. So advantages, this is considered more equitable than the other methods because you are looking at both impervious and pervious surface, and then even more than the previous method we just talked about because you are billing at an exact rate, not an interval. However, the disadvantage is that this is definitely the most time and costly to calculate because you are splitting out impervious and pervious surface for every single parcel in your jurisdiction. And then, like I said, similar to the last one, you're introducing that pervious concept in, so it can just be a little bit more complicated to explain. So we're just going to walk through a quick example of the last method that we just talked about, the equivalent hydraulic area. So the first step in this example would be to measure the impervious surface of the parcel. So for our example parcel, let's say that we had 1,500 square feet of impervious surface. The second step is measuring the pervious surface. And so for our example parcel, we'll have 2,500 square feet of pervious surface. We then set a rate for each. And as you can see, the rate for the impervious surface is 7 times higher than the pervious surface. And then we are multiplying the rate by the area. So for the impervious surface, we have a total of $10.50. And for the pervious surface, we have $2.50. So for our example parcel, the total stormwater fee would be the $13 for a monthly fee. So once you have this primary method, again, this generally funds the majority of your stormwater programs. However, it's always nice to have some options to supplement with some other financial means. We go through several of these in the guidance manual, but I'm just going to highlight some of these look like different fees. So whether you're charging a fee for that maintenance or inspection, plan review fees, connection charges, grants, and then The last one is not necessarily an avenue that generates money. However, if anyone has been attending the meetings about the upcoming permit requirements, ecology is really emphasizing and suggesting that we collaborate with each other and that permittees are working with each other to meet some of these permit requirements. And there is a lot of opportunity to do that with maintenance and inspection of BMPs on private property. So this could be anything from using each other to develop education and outreach, whether you're developing these checklists that you need for maintenance and inspection. You can share resources to develop any of those pre-selected lists for the qualified third parties. Especially if you were starting to develop a program, I would really lean on your neighbors to see what you can borrow from them. That's also the point in this manual, is to we tried to collect some of these resources from both permittees in Eastern Washington and Western Washington, so that if you're having to develop some of these templates, you have a place to start. Okay, back to Slido, because I am curious to see how many jurisdictions in the room use a stormwater utility fee. Okay, great. So this again supports what we have found with talking to a lot of different permittees. The most common method for funding these stormwater programs is developing these stormwater utility fees. So for all those that do use a stormwater utility fee, if you do by chance know what method you use to calculate those fees. Okay, so still have some answers trickling in, but it does look like the most popular method is the ERU, which also supports what we've been finding talking to different permittees. Thank you.